Welcome to the Pharma Source podcast. The way that patients access prescription drugs is changing faster than the infrastructure built to support it. So today I'm joined by Ryan Kelly, who is interim CEO at RX360, someone who's seen this shift from the inside, from Amazon's PillPack acquisition through to the GLP-1 boom, which right now is stress testing every link in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Ryan, welcome to the podcast today. Great to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I think as a starting point, it'd be great if you could just tell us a bit about RX360 itself and your role there, please.
Sure. So RX360 is a membership-based consortium. We're made of approximately 130 members, depending on the M&A that's going on that week. Our primary mission and focus is on patient safety, supply chain security, and using it as a mechanism to share information. We have a very, very large and robust and active joint audit program, which works to help ensure patient safety and supply quality, but also more effectively utilize the resources of our members and customers, as well as I lead up our activity in supply chain security and brand protection. So I also serve as our senior director there. My background has been in both traditional pharmaceutical supply chains and newer digital pharmacy models. So as you mentioned, I helped build out pharmacy operations and technology while at Amazon, as well as at Chewy, which is the largest cash pharmacy in the United States, up until the end of this year. And so again, in the pet space. And so but previously in my career, I've worked with manufacturers, CDMOs, distributors, logistics providers across supply chain and manufacturing. So I've seen this from the production side. I've seen it from the patient facing side. And so I think as we talk about the kind of direct to consumer and the GLP-1 demand and direct to consumer disruptions we're seeing, that'll help inform a lot of my perspective and how we're addressing this at RX360 right now.
What are the kind of discussions, the support that you provide to your members typically?
So in this space right now, a lot of this is for visibility and education. And so as prior to my experience at Amazon, I didn't have a lot of experience, despite working my entire career in the pharmaceutical industry, to what actually happens in a pharmacy. And so part of that is really just educating our manufacturers, our CMOs, CDMOs, distributors, logistics providers. These are what these direct to consumer models look like. Here are some of the trends that we're seeing. Here's some legislative effects that may have a potential implication on the downstream supply chain. And I think across all of this, and where we really focus in is not so much the commercial mechanisms or what's happening. It's more saying, hey, here's what is happening, and here's what the potential implications for the supply chain are going to be. And so I would say the first few months of this year, we're witnessing what I would consider perhaps the most structurally disruptive pharmaceutical moment I've seen in my career. The disruption now isn't going to be something like what we saw with biologics, which reshaped manufacturing, but it's around the disruption. It's commercial, it's digital, and it's all being consumer driven. I think the GLP-1 demand is kind of a phenomenon that we're seeing now that is accelerating this. But I think looking at that and then looking at the direct to consumer models, it's really about control of the patient journey. And so this isn't just a US phenomenon. I think this will be global, but I think the US will be the kind of the first mover from a commercial perspective in the space.
Everyone knows the explosion in the GLP-1 space. How are you tracking that at the moment? I mean, what is the adoption rate of GLP-1 drugs at the moment?
Yeah, I saw this recently that at this point, the adoption rate of GLP-1 since their introduction has now exceeded the rate of the iPhone at their introduction from in 2008. And so this is moving really, really quickly. We just had the Super Bowl here in the United States. Again, commercials here that were all over that. It became a story in and of themselves from, again, Eli Lilly, who has been incredibly prominent here. But we also see Roman, Hims and Hers that have really increased their advertising and focus, particularly in the GLP-1 space. There was an interesting article I read over the weekend. It just came out from the Wall Street Journal. Why GLP-1 is different. And they compared it to the Napster moment, which I thought was really interesting. And it gives you an overview of, the considerations in the space of social media and telehealth that have accelerated demand. It calls out some of the supply shortages that enabled the introduction of compounding and copycat products. It references the direct pricing platforms, whether that's Trump RX, Cost Plus, Amazon, that have increased transparency. And then it's then getting into some of the regulatory enforcement and litigation that are now following. And so again, I going back to Napster really happened when I was in college.
Yeah.
And so it was an interesting and apt, I thought, comparison in terms of how all these things are unfolding. So it does make for very interesting times.
What does it mean when it comes to supply chain infrastructure? What does the speed of that adoption actually mean?
I think the challenge that at least the fear that I have from a supply chain security perspective is the rate of change and the rate of shift is happening faster than our current infrastructure can scale to support.
Hmm.
And so I think, and my members and the people that I speak with regulate RX360 would say I've kind of been saying, hey, this direct to consumer model is going to be happening. Given my experience seeing it at Amazon, I think we've known it was coming. I don't think I envisioned it the way that it would come and at the speed at which it would come, really starting last year and now really accelerating into this year. And so I say that as if you think about the way we've traditionally acquired or obtained our medication, historically, and our legislative model in the United States is largely around that. If you look at the Drug Supply Chain Security Act as an example, there are requirements for manufacturers, then there are requirements for distributors, there are
Mhm.
requirements for 3PLs, and then there are requirements for the pharmacies, mostly managed at the state level. And so and that's generally how the supply chain had moved with, the manufacturer shipping their products to the distributor, who then would ship their products to either the pharmacy or to a hospital or care providing location. And I think what we're seeing now is some of that model is beginning to shift. We're seeing a lot more drugs that are now going to go through the mail. And so again, as you start to push these volumes into areas they weren't at before, you start to see, introduce risks. There's the risk of theft, particularly of these
Okay.
GLP-1 products that are going to be targeted. There are issues with cold chain, given that increased capacity. A lot of these medications are cold chain. And so across all of those different types of risks and capacities in the supply chain, you can start to see areas where these things strain. I think as we look at direct to consumer, though, one area of the supply chain and the brand protection element that I do think is important to bring up is if you're a manufacturer and this is your program, you're going to be partnered with a telehealth provider. You are going to
Mhm.
be partnered with a fulfillment or pharmacy processing operation. There may be payment mechanisms that are in there, but if anything happens, whether it's in the telehealth process, whether it's in the process of approving, paying for, or fulfilling a prescription, if it's a logistics issue, the blame isn't going to go to the third party that's doing it. The blame is going to go to you, the manufacturer whose name is on the program.
Mm.
And so I think this is going to really require, in some ways, different organizations to take a much different view of brand protection than they may have taken in the past.
If we just think about big pharma, for example, what stage do you think they're at in terms of thinking about that full end-to-end customer journey? Amazon obviously being a very good example of famous for that end-to-end customer journey. Where would you say pharma is on that journey at the moment?
I think some pharma companies were early adopters and are ahead of others, but I would say this is very, very early. We are at this point, at most, only a few years into this kind of acceleration in direct to consumer. I remember the launch of, Mark Cuban had an announcement. There was an Eli Lilly partnership with Amazon announcement. I believe it was HIMSS and the HIMSS conference I was at in 2023. Those were fairly significant announcements, and so we're only, not even 3 years removed from that at this point. And so it's still very, very early days. A lot of manufacturers are still identifying, even those that have these programs, they're not necessarily fully embedded in their supply chains yet. A lot of times they're
Mm.
still operating separately as part of commercial and trade. And so I think we're very, very early in how manufacturers are in their journey of how they're going to be
Yeah.
addressing and dealing with these new models.
You yourself were at Amazon, of course, during the PillPack acquisition. So you'd have worked on that, right? The pharmacy dispensing as a service. What did you learn from that experience, which now manufacturers could benefit from?
It was fascinating. I would say the first thing I learned was obviously as a manufacturer, one of the things that your pharmacy service providers can do is, again, we have HIPAA in the United States, which is around protecting patient information. Most manufacturers and their technology solutions are not designed to accommodate HIPAA. The pharmacies themselves are, and
Mhm.
so having them as an operating model that can do those things, just from a sheer regulatory and data management and protection perspective, is helpful. But I would say the one thing that I think would be that I really took away from it is the sense of agency.
Mm.
Again, PillPack had this. I thought they did a really, really great job, and it was part of the reason that Amazon was attracted to them. Was if you even go back to what the PillPack experience was in adherence packaging, you would look at the side of the package, it would have pictures of your medication. Be very, very clear about how often you need to take this medicine daily. The individual package doses. They would do prescription chase, and so if your prescription may be ending at the end of the month, they would reach out to your prescriber on your behalf to get a new prescription on file, or let you know that you needed to see your prescriber, your physician. I
Hmm.
think all of those things, what I really learned there, and I think I would take away, is that sense of agency of they really believed that they owned the entire consumer experience, and they worked back from, you want to make sure that patient is getting their prescription, days ahead of time. So there's not going to be concern or worry there, that you're tracking it all the way through. And I think that it really aligned well with Amazon, particularly at the way Amazon would think about it. It's fulfillment by Amazon. But it was also, what could we use this process for? Could you include, insert cards to inform patients that their drug may be going from a standard release, but would soon be available in an extended release?
Mhm.
Your medication may change in appearance, but also things like for the diabetes category. Hey, here are programs that may help you for diet, nutrition, counseling, any type of things, given the type of indication for the drug. Those things could all be added. And so I would say it took a more holistic patient experience to understand not just the drug that you are providing to them as a manufacturer, but what other drugs is that patient likely to be on? What other issues are they
Hmm.
likely to be having? And so I think it gives you the agency to learn from that as a manufacturer, so you can understand the entire patient journey experience and what that patient's going through.
Yeah. Does it mean that the pharma supply chain team, the operational team to deliver this, do they need to change? Are there missing pieces? I mean, given what you're saying, it feels like customer service feels like that's a component, for example. What type of structural changes are needed?
I think there needs to be an awareness of knowing your supply chain and mapping your supply chain at all ends. It does add complexity, and so as a pharmacy operating in that kind of pharmacy dispensing as a service model, I could be buying those drugs directly from the manufacturer. I could also be buying those from a wholesaler. But in terms of how you think about planning for those things, you need to make sure your demand signals are going to change a little bit. And
Hmm.
so um, I would say that GLP-1s here, as an example, are exposing in some ways how a fragile forecast alignment can become if patient demand bypasses the traditional controls of payers. And so we've seen that surge in demand. We saw the rise in compounding as a result of that demand and how quickly those things moved. And so I think it really does make the case that your forecasting in your team that's driving a lot of that needs to be much more closely aligned to the downstream implications in logistics. You need to know where your inventory is, at what phase it's in,
Hmm.
when it will be available. I would say it in a lot of the different areas. We think about like collaborative planning, forecasting, replenishment, which is something we've seen in CPG and retail for decades now. Pharma never really has gotten to that point, but I think it's going to be a viable model going forward of, as you work with these pharmacy counterparts, knowing how much of your inventory is there, where is it, what level is it, what do you expect your demand to look like, are there reasons
Hmm.
that demand may go up or down, so you can effectively plan inventory account accordingly to make sure you have enough inventory in the right place, as well as making sure you don't have too much. And so I think the other thing that this decentralization does, and I think my experience at Amazon was very helpful for this, is the ability that I thought at Amazon, which I still take away from it, is when you're able to diffuse information and visibility throughout the organization, particularly by technology, you no longer really need to centralize a lot of the governance and decisions that are being made. You can diffuse that into the network. And so you can empower a pharmacy or a fulfillment center. If they see something, they don't necessarily always need to ask for permission. They're able to just act on it and do the right thing because they know that's what they're going to do anyway. And so I would say it's not so much necessarily just a structural change. There will be models that will change where planning and forecasting fit in there. How are you governing different types of logistics providers? Especially if you're seeing a lot more courier providers or parcel providers, given that you're shipping, in this case, higher value products in smaller quantities, and how you manage those things, I think, are going to be different as well. But I would say really a core thing to take a look at is how are you setting up your governance structure, and are you centralizing things in a way that perhaps may need to be decentralized so you can respond fast enough to address the new supply chain challenges you're going to find yourself managing now.
Very interesting. Talking about the digital platforms, how do programs like Lilly Direct or Pfizer for All, Trump RX, are they all the same operationally, or how do they tend to work?
There are some similarities. There are some differences. I would say
Mm,
Trump RX is going to be more of a switch. It's going to be more of an aggregator. And so my
okay.
expectation of what you'll see on Trump RX is if you're looking for a Pfizer drug or a Lilly drug or insert drug company here, it's more likely to route you to their respective platform. But
Okay.
again, it's going to be part of it gives you that there's an umbrella there, but I think it will be more of a switch like that.
The way you're envisioning it, Ryan, you wouldn't actually like fill your basket, say, within Trump RX. All of that would happen at the brand level.
Yeah, that's my expectation. There
Sure.
may be a case at some point with generics where I could see them doing it, but at least in the near term, I don't envision the government, the federal government, standing up new pharmacies to support this. Or even, I mean, the government does have, large scale pharmacies. The Department of Veterans Affairs has a large pharmacy network and capacity, but I don't expect that they're going to be using that to fill prescriptions for Trump RX. I expect those to continue
Hmm.
on as they are. And so, if you were to look at a model that perhaps, if I'll give you an example, if they were partnered with Amazon, there will be a telehealth partner. And so the first piece that comes in is you would go to the Lilly Direct website. They will then move you over to their respective telehealth partner. And so for whatever prescription it is that you're seeking, you'll be screened by a licensed prescriber. And so assuming you meet the requisite requirements and you come out of that, you'll leave that telehealth appointment with a prescription. In the United States, no matter where you get that prescription from, you can take that prescription to any pharmacy that will fill it. But again, given the ease of use and the streamline there, let's say that prescription is then routed through Lilly Direct to Amazon Pharmacy. And
Hmm.
so then Amazon Pharmacy at that point would then be the operations and fulfillment pharmacy. And so they would receive the prescription in. It's going to go through all of your standard pharmacy checks. It's going to go through data entry. There will be a patient profile that will be created if it's not already existing. Again, you want to make sure that you're adjudicating that it's the right drug that's going to the right patient. There's no potential interactions, that all of those things are identified. It'll go through data entry to make sure the prescription is entered correctly, and at which point it'll be verified by a pharmacist. If there is an insurance claim, that'll be adjudicated. And once those things happen, you have a legitimate, genuine prescription that has been reviewed. It'll be sent to a fulfillment pharmacy.
Mm.
That may be in the same facility. It may be in a different facility based on varying areas. Amazon just had a large announcement last week where they're going to be expanding this to something like 3,500 towns, and additional states are going to be added. So the logistics component for Amazon here is significant as well. But from that point, it'll go to one of their network fulfillment pharmacies. The prescription will be filled and labeled. I
Hmm.
would think of pharmacy a lot more like manufacturing. You are manufacturing a discrete vial or unit, individually labeled for that patient, counted with the appropriate medication in the right quantity. That'll then be, in many cases, filled by automation, filled by a robot, but could potentially be filled by a human as well. It'll be filled, it'll be checked, it'll be reviewed by a licensed pharmacist as part of pharmacist verification too. And once that prescription is completed, it will be packed and shipped and mailed to your home or your place
Mm.
of employment.
Quite a fundamental shift then. What does that mean, the shift of for direct to consumer in terms of vulnerabilities? Does it create new vulnerabilities for counterfeit drugs diversion?
It does. One of our members very early on, he kind of showed an example, and he worked with a different partner pharmacy, but he made the joke. He goes, "I wonder how long it's going to take for them to spoof our website."
Yeah, yeah.
And the answer was not long. That
Mm.
happened, within I think a month of him saying that. And so it was very very quickly. And so I would say that's a risk too. Is as more people are comfortable buying their medications online, you will see in many cases that patients are going to go to unlicensed pharmacies. So we focus a lot on this at RX360. I think the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacy is another organization, along with the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. I think they echo this message too. Go and make sure you check who your pharmacy is. Make sure that they're licensed to be doing what they say they're going to
Mm.
be doing. In the United States, you can go to the NADP website. There are other websites that you can go and verify if they're appropriately accredited and licensed. But in that respect too, if a pharmacy is not requiring you to get a prescription, it's probably not legal. And so that's an important area to consider too.
Yeah.
But it introduces a lot more challenges in the last mile and custody complexity. You're going to see a lot more shipping issues that for many manufacturers or even pharmacies. as you're putting a lot more drugs in the mail, you're just going to have more medications that, even by no fault of anyone, will just go missing.
Mm.
That is an always real issue that you have with parcels. Whether you're doing UPS, FedEx, United States Postal Service, you'll have those issues. There are cold chain pressures under speed expectations, and so anything that happens with cold chain that becomes more critical. So your packaging materials for cold chain are become a much more critical component. There are data fragmentation issues that you'll see, across different providers. How are you aggregating and sharing information in a way that's appropriate, but that also is useful? Um, you brought it up, but there's the counterfeit exposure, and we're seeing
Mm.
this particularly around GLP-1s. People will try to sell and introduce product that's not genuine, that's not real. Then there's risk I suspect we'll see due to compounding. We've seen a surge in this kind of microdosing GLP-1 compounds. These are complicated drugs to make, and a lot of these compounders are ramping up very, very quickly. And so inevitably, we've seen this. This was part of the Drug Quality and Security Act of the United States, which the Drug Supply Chain Security Act falls under. But there were also regulations there around, compounding, making sure that you don't see, for instance, a bacterial meningitis outbreak due to a poorly run compounding operation. And so making sure that your compounders, if you're working with them, know what they're doing,
Mm.
making sure they have the right SOPs and quality systems in place. I think that's going to be another area of focus. All of these things too, though, they come up with brand and reputation risk. And so, as I discussed earlier, if you are a manufacturer and you're operating one of these programs, they're not necessarily going to look to the telehealth's name or the pharmacy's name. If it's your name that they're buying from, they're going
Yeah.
to look to you to own the entire experience and make sure that you're managing that. And so with that comes brand and reputation risk that are important to be aware of.
Absolutely. It's moving so fast at the moment. I wonder, Ryan, if you could just maybe give us some advice, perhaps. So, for manufacturers who need to start to engage with this issue, maybe they haven't engaged their supply chain already too much on direct to consumer, where should people get started?
Yeah, I think the first thing is know your supply chain, map out what it currently looks like, know where you're making these drugs, know where you're sourcing your raw materials and components from. That's just good practice in general from a quality perspective, but make sure you really have that documented and shared. The more you can digitize that, so you have the visibility to what inventory is where, the better. But it's also not just looking at your upstream supply chain in the same way that we qualify our suppliers of raw material, API, excipients, et cetera, packaging material, everything that goes into a prescription drug is qualified to make
Mm.
sure that it's not going to have an unintended effect. It's not going to be deleterious to quality. It's not going to introduce any kind of external impurities that could negatively impact the quality of the medication. And so in all of our systems, we know who those suppliers are. We track them. They're qualified. And I think we need to take that same lens and look downstream in the supply chain now. Now, most manufacturers will do that for the companies they sell to immediately. Most often, that's going to be your
Mhm.
distributors. It may be some of the large pharmacy chains as well. But I would say doing that all the way through to the end of the supply chain now becomes much more critical. Know who your pharmacy partners are or will or could be, know where their operations are, understand how quickly their delivery may or may not get to your patients. Make sure they have the right quality systems in place so that you're not introducing any risk in the downstream. As we always say, you can't add quality as you go. You have to maintain quality throughout. And so I would say you'll be serious about auditing all of those players.
Mm.
Also understand their operations, understand what their requirements are. Pharmacy is different. It has all of those quality mechanisms, SOPs, and procedures in place, but it's just governed very differently. It's not the same as a what we would consider like a CGMP environment. It has different requirements that are more appropriate to the pharmacy. There are temperature, there are storage requirements, but understand what those are. Understand if you're working with a partner, what their state-based requirements are going to be, or states of residence versus non-states they operate in. Understand who their partners are. The world of pharmacy, especially when you get into contracts, can become very, very complicated. It's
Mm.
very, very easy in some cases to do the wrong thing, which may open you up to contractual or legal scrutiny for some of those things. And so, again, I would say all of those things are important. But if you haven't started a program, I would say talk to who you think might be the right partner or the right channel. The other thing that, in my experience in pharmaceutical manufacturing and with the manufacturers I saw, was more often than not, it wasn't so much an iterative approach. It was a go all at once. And I would say here is going to be a good time if you're going to move into one of these programs. I would say go in an iterative way. Don't feel like you need to have everything lined up at first. Move more quickly, bring the right people along so everyone's informed, but iterate. If this model or this drug and this program doesn't work, fail fast or identify how to tweak it so it does work. I think taking that iterative approach and having that as a mindset as you go into these direct to consumer models, because that's what many of those that are playing in here tend to operate with, whether it's technologically or operationally. And again, it's one of those things where it allows them to do pilots or proof of concepts a lot faster to get to a version that the customer will appreciate, kind of that minimum viable or minimum lovable product. Again, that doesn't happen immediately. It generally happens after multiple iterations. And so I would say keeping a focus on that's always helpful. I would just say for your CDMO audience, and I know you have one, they're exposed to this too, and so I think it's important for them to know and understand what their manufacturers are dealing with. There's a lot of things going on in addition to the direct-to-consumer models. There's the tariff and kind of trade shift. So understanding how all of these things are operating right now is important, so you can understand capacity, demand, how quickly your partners may need to scale up capacity. And so I think it's just important for those organizations to be aware too, but also keep an eye on the capacity, but also keep an eye on trade and transfer pricing, areas of tax that could change and have an impact on the organization. So that's just another area I would keep an eye on.
Ryan, fascinating speaking to you today. Thank you. And looking forward very much for you joining us in May at CDMO Live Europe, of course, as well.
I'm looking forward to it. I had a great time in Rotterdam last year. I'm looking forward to it again.